Admiral William McRaven sat in the back of the military transport plane, his body aching in ways it never had before. The flight from Germany to the United States was long, giving him far too much time to think about what had happened. Just days earlier, he had been in the prime of his career, a Navy SEAL who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Now, he could barely move without feeling as though his body was tearing apart from the inside. The year was 2001, and McRaven was participating in a routine training exercise that he had done countless times before. Jumping out of airplanes was second nature to him, something he had mastered over years of service. But on this particular day, something went terribly wrong. As he descended toward the drop zone, another parachutist came out of nowhere, and the impact was violent and unexpected. McRaven felt himself tumbling through the air, completely out of control. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what had happened. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had been knocked unconscious or if he was just dazed. The ground was rushing toward him, and he couldn't stop spinning. The situation grew worse by the second. As he tumbled, his pilot chute came out and wrapped around one of his legs. Then another part of the parachute, called the riser, wrapped around his other leg. McRaven was now completely tangled in his own parachute, falling toward the earth at terrifying speed. He had experienced close calls before, but nothing quite like this. There was a moment of pure terror as he realized just how much trouble he was in. Then, after what felt like an eternity of falling, his parachute finally opened. The relief lasted only a split second. When a parachute opens, it blossoms with tremendous force. That force, combined with the way he was tangled and the speed of his fall, caused his body to absorb an impact it was never designed to handle. McRaven felt something give way inside him. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He hit the ground hard, harder than he had ever hit anything in his life. For a long moment he lay there, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The medics reached him quickly, and he could see the concern on their faces. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to a medical facility. It was there that he received the news that would change everything. His pelvis was broken. For most people, a broken pelvis is a devastating injury. For a Navy SEAL, and it could mean the end of everything they had worked for. McRaven had spent his entire adult life building a career in the most elite fighting force the world had ever known. He had endured basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, widely considered the toughest military training in the world. He had survived the brutal workouts, the constant cold, the lack of sleep, and the psychological pressure designed to make men quit. He had never once considered ringing that bell. Now, lying in a hospital bed with his body broken, he faced a different kind of challenge. The doctors told him he would need extensive recovery time. He would have to learn to walk again. There was no guarantee he would ever be able to return to active duty, let alone continue as a SEAL. McRaven's journey to this point had been shaped by determination from the very beginning. Growing up in Texas, he wasn't the biggest or strongest kid around. His father had been a World War II Spitfire pilot and even played in the NFL, but his son had to find his own path. McRaven discovered that path in running. He joined the track team and worked tirelessly to improve. There was a particular moment that stood out in his memory, a conversation with his old coach, Jerry Turnbow, the night before what would be his final race. His coach told him he could break the school record if he just ran hard. McRaven took that advice to heart, went out the next day, and did exactly what his coach said. He broke the record, and that achievement gave him the confidence to believe he could do other difficult things, like becoming a Navy SEAL. That same determination would now have to carry him through the darkest period of his life. As he recovered from his injury, the world changed forever. On September 11th, 2001, terrorists attacked the United States. McRaven watched the towers fall on television, unable to do anything but sit and heal while his brothers in arms answered the call. He was still recovering from his broken pelvis, still struggling to walk normally, while the nation he had sworn to defend went to war. The frustration was almost unbearable. Here he was, a Navy SEAL trained for exactly this kind of conflict, stuck on the sidelines. He pushed himself harder in his recovery, determined to get back in the fight. He worked with physical therapists, endured painful exercises, and slowly, gradually, began to rebuild his body. The doctors had told him it might not be possible, but McRaven had never been good at accepting limitations. Months passed, and eventually, he was cleared to return to duty. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but he made it back. The Navy SEAL, who had been broken in half during a training exercise, was once again ready to serve. The years that followed would test him in ways he never could have imagined. He was assigned to the White House to work on counterterrorism in the aftermath of 9/11. It was during this time that a terrorist named Richard Reed attempted to detonate explosives hidden in his shoes on a flight from Paris to Miami. The incident sparked a need for new security measures, and McRaven came up with an idea that would change air travel forever. And he suggested that passengers should take off their shoes going through security and that laptops should be checked separately. What he thought would be a temporary measure for a few months became a permanent part of life for travelers around the world. He would later joke about it, acknowledging that there were probably many people looking for him to express their frustration, but at the time, it was a necessary step to keep people safe. In 2003, McRaven found himself in Iraq commanding the task force that would capture one of the most brutal dictators in modern history. Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq with an iron fist for decades, and bringing him to justice was a critical mission. When Hussein was finally captured, McRaven became his jailer for 30 days. The experience was surreal. Hussein came in arrogant and pompous, still acting like the powerful leader he had once been. McRaven tried to reason with him, hoping that he would agree to tell his followers to lay down their arms and end the fighting. It would have been a small measure of good coming from a man who had caused so much suffering. But Hussein refused. He chose to remain defiant to the end. McRaven looked at him and delivered a simple message. If he wasn't going to help, then this would be the last time they would ever speak. And it was. He walked away and never looked back. The war on terror kept McRaven constantly moving between Iraq and Afghanistan. The pace was relentless. Some nights, they would run 20 or 25 missions in Iraq alone, with another 10 to 12 in Afghanistan. He led his men on night raids, always pushing forward, always hunting the next target. He saw things that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. He watched men under his command display incredible courage in the face of overwhelming odds. He also watched some of them make the ultimate sacrifice. Since 9/11, 430 members of the Special Operations Command had been killed in action. McRaven carried every one of those losses with him. There were dark moments when the weight of command seemed almost too heavy to bear. But in those dark moments, he also saw people rise up. He saw families dealing with unimaginable loss, soldiers taking care of the families of the fallen, entire communities coming together to honor those who had given everything. Those moments reminded him why the fight was worth it. Through it all, McRaven never forgot the lesson of his injury. He knew that life could change in an instant, that everything he had worked for could be taken away in the blink of an eye. That knowledge made him appreciate every mission, every moment with his men, every opportunity to serve. Then came the call that would define his legacy. CIA Director Leon Panetta summoned McRaven for a briefing that would change the course of history. The intelligence community had finally located Osama bin Laden, the man responsible for the 9/11 attacks. He was hiding in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, not far from a Pakistani military academy. The intelligence was as solid as it could be, but there was no way to be absolutely certain without putting boots on the ground. Panetta looked at McRaven and told him that the mission to eliminate bin Laden was his. McRaven, who was then serving as a vice admiral heading the Pentagon's Joint Special Operations Command, was given full authority to plan and execute the operation. The weight of that responsibility was enormous. If he got it wrong, if the intelligence was bad, if the mission failed, the consequences would be devastating. McRaven threw himself into the planning. He studied every detail of the compound, every piece of intelligence they had on bin Laden's habits and security. He considered multiple options, including bombing the compound from the air, but ultimately decided that a ground assault by helicopter was the only way to be absolutely certain of bin Laden's identity and to recover any intelligence that might be in the compound. As the planning progressed, McRaven gathered the SEAL team that would carry out the mission, and they were the best of the best, men who had been on hundreds of missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. McRaven looked at them and thought about the movie Hoosiers, where Gene Hackman's character takes his small-town team to the state championship and tells them to just play the game the way they always had. That was his message to the SEALs. They had all done this before. They had all been on countless night raids. This mission was no different. Another night, another raid. Do it the way they always had, and they would be just fine. On the night of May 1st, 2011, McRaven sat in his command post in Afghanistan, monitoring every aspect of the operation. In the White House Situation Room, President Obama and his national security team watched the same feeds, holding their breath as the mission unfolded. The helicopters approached the compound. The assault force fast roped down to the ground, and then disaster nearly struck. One of the stealth helicopters, a highly advanced and expensive piece of technology, crash-landed inside the compound. The situation could have fallen apart right there. But the SEALs adapted, as they always did. They continued the mission while securing the downed aircraft. Minutes passed like hours. Then, finally, the call came. The ground force commander's voice crackled through the radio. "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo." McRaven knew what those words meant. They had gotten bin Laden. When the SEALs returned to Afghanistan, they brought bin Laden's body with them. McRaven needed to confirm the identification before reporting to the president. He looked at the body and knew that bin Laden had been about 6 feet 4 inches tall. Nearby, a young SEAL stood waiting. McRaven called him over. "Hey, son, how tall are you?" McRaven asked. "Sir, I'm 6'2", the SEAL replied. "Good, come here. I want you to lie down next to the remains." It wasn't exactly scientific, but it was good enough for McRaven to make the call. He reported to the president that bin Laden was dead. A few days later, President Obama called McRaven to the White House. The president looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and amusement. "Okay, Bill, let me get this straight," Obama said. "You had $60 million for a helicopter, and you didn't have $10 for a tape measure?" McRaven didn't know what to say. The president reached behind his desk and pulled out a plaque. Mounted on it was a Stanley 25-foot Powerlock tape measure. The inscription read, "If we can afford a $60 million helicopter, I think we can afford a tape measure." McRaven laughed. It was a moment of levity after one of the most intense periods of his life, a reminder that even in the midst of historic events, there was room for humor. The bin Laden raid made headlines around the world. McRaven's name became known to people who had never heard of him before. He was named a finalist for Time's Person of the Year. But for McRaven, the raid was just one mission among thousands. He thought about all the other missions he had commanded, missions that would never make the history books, that were more complicated, more challenging, that cost more lives and demanded more sacrifice. Those missions mattered just as much. In 2014, McRaven retired from the military after 37 years of service, and he had risen to the rank of 4-star Admiral and was the longest-serving active-duty Navy SEAL, known as the Bullfrog. He thought that commanding the bin Laden raid would be the crowning achievement of his career, the thing he would be remembered for. But life had other plans. The president of the University of Texas at Austin, McRaven's alma mater, invited him to be the commencement speaker in 2014. McRaven prepared a speech about the 10 lessons he had learned from basic SEAL training. He talked about making your bed every morning to accomplish the first task of the day. He talked about never ringing the bell, never giving up. He talked about the power of small things to change your life and maybe the world. The speech was posted online and went viral. Millions of people watched it. McRaven turned it into a best-selling book called Make Your Bed. Suddenly, everywhere he went, people approached him. They knew nothing about the bin Laden raid, nothing about his 37 years as a Navy SEAL, but they knew that he had told them to make their bed. McRaven found that amusing and deeply satisfying. The raid on bin Laden's compound was important, but it was a moment of violence in a long and bloody war. The speech about making your bed was something positive, something that could help people in their everyday lives. It was a reminder that sometimes the simplest lessons are the most powerful. Throughout his career, McRaven had thought a lot about the nature of war. He wrote about it in his memoir, Sea Stories. He reflected on how war challenges a man's sense of himself, how it reaffirms courage, and how it sets warriors apart from those who only watch from the sidelines. War builds unbreakable bonds between those who fight together. It gives life meaning in ways that peace never can. He acknowledged that peace was meant for some people, but probably not for him. He had found himself at war, and he tried to make the best of it. He hoped that what he did was noble and honorable, and if that was the case, then he was proud to be called a warrior. When asked if he had gotten enough war, McRaven didn't hesitate. He had gotten enough. He had seen enough, done enough, lost enough. It was time for others to carry the load. Looking back on his life, McRaven could trace the chain of events that had brought him to where he was. If he hadn't broken that school record in the mile, he might never have believed he could become a SEAL. Then, if he hadn't become a SEAL, he wouldn't have been in that training exercise in 2001. If he hadn't been injured, he might have been somewhere else on September 11th, doing something else. If he hadn't recovered, he wouldn't have been in position to command the bin Laden raid. Every moment, even the ones that seemed disastrous at the time, had led to something else. The injury that nearly ended his career, the moment when he was broken in half and left lying on the ground wondering if he would ever walk again, had become part of a larger story. It was a story about resilience, about refusing to quit, about getting back up no matter how many times life knocked you down. It was a story that would inspire people he would never meet, people who would never know his name but who would hear his message and find the strength to keep going. Admiral William McRaven, the Navy SEAL who was almost killed in a training accident, who captured Saddam Hussein, who commanded the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, who told millions of people to make their beds, finally laid down his burdens and embraced the peace he had earned. But the lessons he learned, the stories he told, and the example he set would live on long after he left the battlefield. The admiral who had been broken and rebuilt, who had faced death and refused to accept defeat, had earned his rest. And when people asked him about his legacy, about the bin Laden raid and the medals and the promotions, he would smile and tell them the truth. None of it mattered as much as the simple act of getting up every morning, making your bed, and doing the next right thing. That was the real lesson. That was what really mattered. And that was how you changed the world, one small act at a time,